Hi history lovers, and welcome back to the channel where I bring you new videos every week on all aspects of history. Today we're looking at the life of Edward VI, the last child king of England and indeed the last Tudor king. We'll learn how he got along with his father, Henry VIII, and his sisters, Mary I and Elizabeth I, and at how two of his maternal uncles, Thomas and Edward Seymour, ended up being executed during his reign. We'll also find out how Edward tried to overthrow the order of succession established by his father's will by leaving the throne to his Protestant cousin, Lady Jane Grey, so that she would become the first Queen of England rather than the Catholic Mary or even Elizabeth. This history calling video is the latest in my Tudor Monarchs series, and I encourage you to check out the other entries using the link in the description box. Please also like, share and comment on this video and subscribe to the channel with notifications switched on so you never miss an upload. Edward was born at Hampton Court on the 12th of October 1537, though not by caesarean section as you might see claimed in some places. His birth marked the end of Henry VIII's 28-year quest for a male heir, and the king was ecstatic at finally having a healthy son. There were celebrations across London, and the baby was given a spectacular christening on the 15th of October, at which his eldest half-sister Mary stood as his godmother, and his other sister, the 4-year-old Elizabeth, carried the christening robe, though she was so little that she had to be carried herself. The celebrations didn't last long, however, for after initially appearing to recover from the birth, his mother, Queen Jane Seymour, soon succumbed to childbed fever, possibly caused by the retention of part of the placenta after Edward's arrival, and on the 24th of October she died. This plunged Henry VIII into an intense but, all in all, fairly brief period of mourning, but for baby Edward it made no difference, as he had no memory of his mother. He would later keep a diary or journal, the first portion of which was written in the third person, in which he described his earliest childhood. There he recorded that he was, quote, brought up till he came to 6 years old among the women. These included his lady mistress, Margaret Bryan, who had previously held the same post for his sister Elizabeth, plus one Sybil Penn and a number of rockers to rock his cradle. This portrait of him at a year old was done by Hans Holbein and shows a thriving baby with fair hair, a chubby face, and an outfit so stunning it makes the romper suits modern-day babies wear look like rags. He was certainly the apple of his father's eye, or his most precious jewel, to use Henry's phrase. In the spring of 1538, while staying with his father at Royston, the local townspeople were thrilled to see the king, quote, with much mirth and joy, dallying with the prince in his arms a long space, and so holding him in a window to the sight and comfort of all. He was thought to be a good child by those who raised him. Margaret Bryan recalled that he was merry and marvellous pleasantly disposed, and that once, while staying at Hunsdon, the minstrels played, and his grace danced and played so wantonly that he could not stand still, and was as full of pretty toys as ever I saw a child in my life. Still, he had a temper, and when he caught malaria at the age of 4, he told his doctor, when asked by him if he felt the need to vomit, to go away, fool. Being a royal, he also already had one failed engagement under his belt by the age of 6, after his betrothal to the infant Mary Queen of Scots fell through. But at least he could take comfort in the newest stepmother he had acquired. After a short marriage to Anne of Cleves in 1540, which was annulled after 6 months, and a roughly 18-month marriage to Catherine Howard, which ended in her execution in February 1542, Henry married Catherine Parr in July 1543. Of all the would-be mothers he had in his life, she made the greatest impact on Edward, and there survive at the British Library a number of letters he wrote to her, in which he called her, sometimes in Latin no less, his dearest mother. I'll leave a link for these for you in the description box if you'd like to take a look at them. Some of them are in English too, and as Edward's handwriting was quite stiff and juvenile, it's actually pretty easy to make out. His diary is also there if you're interested. As his Latin writings suggest, Edward's education was well underway by this point, and he was noted as being bright and quick to learn. His teachers included John Cheek, who had been a professor of Greek at Cambridge University, Roger Ascham, who also taught Princess Elizabeth, and Anthony Cook. Edward recorded in his diary that he was taught languages, including French by a man named Jean Belmont, another tutor he shared with Elizabeth, as well as learning about scripture, of philosophy, and all liberal sciences. Most importantly of all, his tutors raised him to be an ardent Protestant. He also spent much, though not all, of this time living with his sisters Mary and Elizabeth. Soon, however, his life would change forever, for on the 28th of January 1547, Henry died. Edward recorded the event in his diary with little emotion, saying only that he had been taken to Princess Elizabeth's residence at Enfield, where, quote, the Earl of Hertford declared to him and his younger sister Elizabeth the death of their father. Other sources expand on this a little and tell us that the two children cried and hugged each other. Edward was now the king. By the 31st of January he was in London, and on the 20th of February he was crowned in Westminster Abbey in a new Protestant version of the coronation service, during which his amended coronation oath and the sermon delivered by the Archbishop of Canterbury, Thomas Cranmer, made clear that the king was answerable only to God. Of course, at 9 years old, Edward was still too young to actually rule anything, and it had been his father's intention, expressed through his last will and testament, that a minority council would manage the country on his behalf until he came of age, with no one person in overall control. This part of the will was quickly set aside, however, and though the council remained, the new king's maternal uncle, Edward Seymour, Lord Hertford, the man who had broken the news of Henry's death to him, was named Protector of the Realm and Governor of Edward's person, and made Duke of Somerset. This angered Somerset's brother Thomas Seymour, Baron Seymour of Sudeley and Lord High Admiral, who felt that he didn't have sufficient power and prestige during the minority, and his reaction to the situation set him on a collision course with his sibling. Thomas tried to insinuate himself further into the royal family by marrying the Dowager Queen Catherine Parr, though only after his overtures to Princess Elizabeth were rejected. It was a move which much offended his brother, according to King Edward. He then harassed and even groomed and assaulted Elizabeth when she came to live with him and Catherine. This continued, sometimes with Catherine's connivance, until the day she walked in on the two of them in each other's arms and promptly sent Elizabeth away in May 1548. I'll be dealing with this story in much more detail when I get to Elizabeth, but in the meantime, if you see my video on Catherine Parr, I do spend a few minutes on this episode there, albeit from Catherine's point of view. I also have a whole series on Henry VIII's wives, which you can check out as well if you're interested. When Catherine died in childbirth in September 1548, the plan to marry Elizabeth was resurrected, but again rejected. At the same time, Thomas also tried to undermine his brother Somerset as protector and win the affections of their nephew. Somerset kept Edward on a tight leash, so Thomas took to slipping the boy pocket money and notes, hoping to get the king to reject Somerset as his protector and replace him with Thomas. This plan backfired, however, when he arrived at the king's door one night to find it locked and in his anger shot dead the boy's barking pet dog. Somerset found out what his brother was up to, and there was talk that perhaps Thomas had planned to kidnap Edward and marry Elizabeth to secure his grip on power. The protector reacted with force. He had his brother found guilty of treason by act of attainder and executed at the Tower on the 20th of March 1549. Edward barely reacted in his diary, saying only that the Lord Sudeley, Admiral of England, was condemned to death and died the March ensuing. I'd be interested to hear in the comments what you make of this reaction. Do you think that Edward was a cold fish, so to speak, who could have saved his uncle but didn't care to? Or do you think that at 11 years old the king was unable to intervene in Thomas's case and change his fate? Edward's council was keen to push on with the Protestant Reformation, but this led to revolt in western counties in 1548 and 1549, first in anger at the removal of religious images from churches, then due to dislike of a new prayer book issued in 1549, which was written in English rather than Latin. After Somerset dithered about what to do, the revolts were finally suppressed by Lord Russell in August 1549, but in the meantime trouble had also broken out in the east of the country, and the town of Norwich was occupied on the 22nd of July by a group of people under the command of a tanner named Robert Kett. Somerset sent an insufficient force under the command of William Parr, Marquess of Northampton, to retake the town, and when this failed, John Dudley, Earl of Warwick, had to take a larger army to retake Norwich and defeat the rebels, 2,000 of whom were killed at the end of August. Kett was imprisoned in the Tower of London and found guilty of treason in late November. He was executed on the 7th of December when he was hanged from the walls of Norwich Castle. The whole thing had been a fiasco, and it seriously undercut the nobility's respect for Somerset and belief in his ability to manage the country. His position and popularity were not helped by the fact that he had also made war with Scotland and France and nearly bankrupted Edward in the process. Realising the fragility of his position, Somerset woke up the 12-year-old king at 9 or 10 p.m. on the 6th of October 1549 and removed him from Hampton Court to the more secure Windsor Castle, where Edward reported that there was watch and ward kept every night. Somerset hoped to fortify his position by this drastic move, but Edward was not amused. He complained that he was ill and that his accommodation was not suitable, and in the face of his increasing hostility and overwhelming opposition from the English ruling elite, Somerset surrendered himself on the 11th. 2 days later, his protectorate was dissolved and replaced by a council ruling for the king. He himself was imprisoned in the Tower of London on the 14th. He confessed to the 29 charges laid against him and was stripped of his positions and much of his income in January 1550. He was then released, however, and pardoned at the beginning of February, and seemed to be well on his way to recovering royal favour and much of his power and property, even dining with Edward in April. There was talk that he was trying to regain his position as protector, however, and it was this which led to his downfall, though it's unclear if it was actually true. John Dudley, who was now the Duke of Northumberland, was one of the major political powerhouses of the reign, and he had Somerset arrested on the 16th of October and sent to the Tower once more on charges of treason. The king's uncle was found guilty of felony, though not of treason, on the 1st of December, and beheaded at the Tower on the 22nd of January 1552. Again, I'd love to hear what you make of this. Edward was by now 14, and personally I think that had he wanted to, he could have intervened on this uncle's behalf, but he disliked him so much that he chose to allow him to be killed. Perhaps you disagree though, so let me know what you think below. Edward was also having problems with his sister Mary. A devoted Catholic, she refused to cease practicing her religion and hearing Mass, despite it being illegal after the 1549 Act of Uniformity, and she had her powerful cousin, Charles V of Spain, intervene to ask that she be exempted from this law. This request was refused, though Edward's council said that she could hear Mass privately until the king came of age. She continued to allow anyone who came to her house to hear it, though, which was not the level of privacy the council had intended. The situation deteriorated, and in early 1550 she decided to try to flee England on ships sent by Charles. These arrived at the end of June, but at the last minute Mary had second thoughts and was persuaded to stay. Edward was increasingly frustrated with her continuing intransigence, and he ordered her to come to London in March 1551. Brother and sister had a tense standoff, during which he berated her for continuing to hear Mass. But Mary held her ground, and despite the arrest of some of her chaplains and the objections of the king and his council, she continued to practice Catholicism. As the heir to the throne and a wealthy landed magnate in her own right, with the same very powerful Spanish relations behind her that her mother had once had, there was little else that Edward could do to stop her. Instead, the official ban on her practicing her religion remained in place, and she continued to ignore it. When she came to court again in June 1552, the matter was tactfully overlooked. In February 1553, Edward fell ill with a cold, which soon developed into what contemporaries called consumption, likely what we would now term tuberculosis. In April, he wrote that he had contracted measles and smallpox, and he was coughing up blood and bile. It was evident that he was dying. And so his mind now turned to the succession. Desperate to prevent the Catholic Mary from taking the throne, he drafted a document known as his Device for the Succession, which cut her and Elizabeth out of it. Why, you might ask, did he remove Elizabeth, who was Protestant like him? There seem to have been a few reasons. One was that he considered her, and indeed Mary, to be illegitimate. If you saw my previous video on the final years of Henry VIII, you'll know that he'd had both daughters declared illegitimate when he abandoned their mothers, and though he restored them to the succession, he never re-legitimised them. Another concern for Edward was that Elizabeth could marry a foreigner, just as Mary would eventually do, potentially making England a satellite of a great European power. Finally, he may well have suspected that Elizabeth would simply refuse to replace Mary, who was the elder sister and the one whom Henry VIII had left the throne to after Edward in his will. According to that same will, the next in line was their cousin, Frances Grey, Duchess of Suffolk, daughter of Mary Tudor, Queen of France, and Charles Brandon. She in turn had 3 daughters, the eldest of whom was Lady Jane Grey. Despite his already limited options, Edward disliked the idea of leaving his throne to a woman, and instead his initial plan was to leave it to the Lady Frances's heirs male, though she didn't have any sons at this point, then to her daughter Jane's heirs male. The 15-year-old Jane was quickly married off on the 21st of May 1553 to the Duke of Northumberland's son Guildford Dudley, that's the brother of Elizabeth's future favourite Robert Dudley. But within weeks it was obvious that there wasn't time to wait for a boy to be born to her. The device was now altered so that it skipped Frances Grey altogether, and the phrase Lady Jane's heirs male became Lady Jane and her heirs male. The legality of the entire document was incredibly tenuous. Edward's advisers told him that only an Act of Parliament could overthrow the 1544 Act of Succession, and that as a minor he couldn't make a will, but he bullied many of them into accepting his device. The king was by now on his deathbed, and there was nothing left to do but wait for the end. It came on the 6th of July at Greenwich Palace, with his final prayers being that England would not succumb to Catholicism. When his body was opened, it was found that the disease whereof his majesty died was the disease of lungs, which had in them 2 great ulcers and were putrefied. Again, this strongly suggests tuberculosis. England's first Protestant king was buried in an unmarked grave in Westminster Abbey on the 8th of August, by which time his attempt to have Mary superseded by Lady Jane Grey had failed miserably, and the 9-day Queen, as Jane became known, was under lock and key in the Tower. That story more properly belongs to Mary's reign, however, so make sure you return to the channel for her upcoming videos and for Elizabeth's. If you enjoyed hearing about Edward's life, please give this video a thumbs up and share it, and remember to subscribe if you haven't done so already. Let me know in the comments below what you think of Edward. Was he a mere puppet, or do you see in his attitude towards and dealings with his 2 Seymour uncles and Mary a tyrant in the making? I'm looking forward to reading your thoughts. I'll be back next week to start digging into Mary's life, and until then, keep learning.